Welcome to Behind the Play, a video and podcast product of The Hoop Show that explores the lives of Geelong players past and present, as well as the off-field figures that are keeping us Geelong strong. My name is Paul James. Today I have the great pleasure to introduce and discuss and talk with James Button. How are you?
G'day, Paul. It's great to be here.
It's going to be awesome to have a chat, and for anyone who's perhaps not familiar, you've got a fantastic book that it's been a few years since it was launched now at this point, but totally honed in on the Cats there, and we'll get an upfront plug out of the way to make sure that everyone is completely across it. Come back, The Rise and Fall of Geelong. Before we dive deeper into it, let's go a little bit surface level. What is the story there for the book?
Yeah, so Paul, look, I grew up following the Cats from the age of 7. I'm actually 62 now, so I'm pretty old. And so when I started following the Cats, they were a good side in the late 60s.
Yep.
They had Billy Goggin, Doug Wade, Peter Pianto was coach at that time. Dennis Marshall had left, but they were still, what's his name? Ryan, the centre forward. Bill Ryan. Yep. Great player. And then just as I started following him, they fell over a cliff. And they basically, through the 70s, they were very much a struggling side. Only
making up the numbers.
Same in the 80s. They had a couple of good years at the start of the 80s, but then, they were very much in the 80s a struggling side. And then they had that incredible period under Malcolm Blight when in 7 years, they made 4 grand finals and lost every single one of them. And, I used to go to the footy week in, week out with my dad and my brother. And we had sort of really developed a view that, Geelong was never going to win a premiership. It was sort of in our fate. It was in our stars that we were one of those teams.
Close but no cigar all the time.
A bit like being a Saints fan, I guess.
Yes. Sorry, Saints fans listening.
Sorry. But that sense of like you're never going to get there, and that it becomes part of your psyche at some level. And I remember in the 90s thinking, but this game is going national now. And we couldn't win in the VFL. We came so close many times. We famously lost the 89 grand final by 6 points, after we'd gone the knuckle in the first quarter and sort of got somewhat distracted from getting the ball, and then
a string of early 90s opportunities.
Yeah,
certainly for me. So I was born in 89, and my first memory of kind of the really decisive memory of the Cats was unfortunately the 95 grand final, which I don't know, can't we have like a Joe Watson, Sam Mitchell, Trent Cotchin style thing there? They breached the salary cap. Can't we just take the little star next to it and get ourselves a premiership?
And what's interesting about that game is that game was over after 10 minutes. You could just feel it. Like I remember hearing someone behind me saying, my worst nightmare is coming true. Carlton wins by 10 goals and Greg Williams wins the Norm Smith. And
there it was.
I just remember Silvani, the way he played on Ablett that day, like he was just incredible. He was Ablett would go forward and Silvani be right behind him with this huge arm coming in front of him, just punching the ball away. And it was just their heads were down. They were a very good side, Carlton, that year. They lost 2 games only the whole year. And once they got a run on, our heads dropped, And I guess, Paul, the thing is that I think we all felt that as the game went national, this town on the edge of the big city, this country cousins, Sleepy Hollow, famously in the history of, and that term, Sleepy Hollow, goes back to the mid-19th century, and, that basically that Geelong didn't have the kind of big city smarts that would get them to win a premiership as the game was becoming more professional, becoming national.
More competitive,
And of course, that's not what happened, right? And it was such a big thing for me and my family to win that premiership in 2007 for so many Geelong people after 44 years. The scenes in Geelong that night, I wasn't down there, but, it was like Liberation Day at the end of World War II in Paris, the crowds going crazy in the streets.
Yes.
It meant so much. And then they didn't just stop there. They won 3 premierships in 5 years, and kept winning.
And then remained competitive from that point on too.
Like,
one blip on the radar.
66 to 70%, win rate in games. So I wanted to explain, I wanted to understand myself, and I wanted to explain what had happened down at Geelong, and what was the relationship between the team and the town. Like,
It is a
had there been
unique
a,
one.
it is a unique one, and it's still a unique one now. And we might just talk about that, in this conversation, about how I feel, in a way, the nature of the town is playing in Geelong's favour, whereas for decades I think it played against Geelong. And like, it had played for Geelong back in the day when we could draw on all the great players of the Western
Yeah,
District, and then
the
zoning came
catchment.
in, and we just didn't cope with zoning. We were just, we couldn't get over, losing the Western District. And then the National League came, and everybody knows the story. In the late '90s, a new board was picked. We got a new CEO, Brian Cook, a new coach, Mark Bomber Thompson, and as they say, the rest is history. But
And obviously the amazing Frank Costa there at the top too.
yeah, and of course Frank Costa, who was the head of that board, and who chose, the board chose Brian Cook. And the relationship between Frank Costa and Brian Cook, very important in those years. And I just wanted to explain that. And I didn't want to just explain it as a footy book, but as a book about a country town, and its relationship to its footy club. Like, basically in the '80s, there were all these really nasty brawls, on the Geelong board about who could be president of the club, because in a town like Geelong, to be president of the footy club was to be king of Geelong.
Yeah.
And all sorts of people wanted that job. And so that was why I wrote that book. And I spoke to a lot of people and had a lot of fun doing it, I can tell you.
Look, and for anyone who's watching or listening today and actually hasn't checked out the book before, I implore you to do so. It was actually quite exciting when, and I guess going behind the scenes for people who watch and listen to the show, Ben does all the legwork for me when it comes to lining up guests and all that. So he's an absolute powerhouse, workhorse, and does an amazing job. And I was really quite excited when I saw your name on there, actually, because I just had to have this moment where I looked at the bookshelf. We're talking about the same person, aren't we? Like, it was very much that slow realization. Hang on, I've read that. I've read that book. Hang on, I know that. I know that author. I get to chat to that author. This is going to be really quite cool. And I mean, it's a fantastic piece you put together. So for those who are watching and listening, I implore you to go check it out. And it's been out for a few years now, but it's still a fascinating read. And ultimately, that culture that was built that you discuss in the book is the same culture really that exists today. I don't think there's been too much deviation. I know there were some concerns about what would happen when Joel Selwood walked out the door, but I mean, look, we had an initial form blip and people wanted to quickly point some fingers for a moment, and Joel was having a great time over with the Australian cricket team, and everyone's starting to worry a little bit, but that Geelong DNA that's been formed over the last 20 years has remained rock solid.
It really has, and long may it last. There was a really great piece in The Age last year, which I recommend all listeners go and check out. It was written by Jake Nile, the Age footy writer, and it tried to explain why Geelong was so successful in this in these last few years. And he coined this term, the Geelong Road discount, which is that, it goes to your point, Paul. A lot of players have wanted to play at Geelong, right?
Yeah.
And so, Geelong stars like Joel Selwood, Tom Hawkins, Paddy Dangerfield, and then newcomers like Isaac Smith have taken salary cuts to play in that club. And so by taking that salary cut, they have enabled, obviously, the whole club to fit under the cap, to get new players. I think if you look at our recruiting over the last 10 years, we actually haven't done that well in the draft, but we've done really well on free agency, and restricted agency, and picking, Jeremy Cameron, Isaac Smith, Gary Rowan, to name three.
And to the great credit of the club, also, like, trading is a big part of that too, because obviously, like you mentioned, Jeremy Cameron, and for the longest time during that whole scenario, it felt like, okay, what are they going to get as compensation for it? But it wasn't that in the end. Like, Geelong had to come to the trade table, and I mean, everyone thought we were forfeiting a king's bounty at the time, but look what it got us. And Absolutely. I don't think there's any arguing. Look, his form's been a little bit patchy in the last couple of weeks, but there's been injuries in there as well. But honestly, like, he's paid it back in spades already.
Oh, totally. I mean, in one way, you could say that he won us the flag last year, not
Absolutely.
because he played such a great game in the grand final, but because of his game against
the leader.
Yeah. I mean, that game against Collingwood was just an astonishing game of footy. He kept us in the game, kicking some of those freakish goals from the boundary, and we could have easily gone under to Collingwood that day, and thanks to him, we came through.
Yeah,
So,
Jeremy and Gary Rowan were huge. And again,
yeah,
Gary Rowan, another
yeah, Gary Ryan.
import from another
Yeah.
team.
Yeah, and like Gary's interesting because I think he's frustrated a lot of fans.
Yeah,
But to the credit of the club, they've stuck with him, and we probably don't always see the hard work that he does on the forward line. He's tough. He's a big body,
yeah.
and he tackles hard. He keeps the ball in. He knows where the goals are. So I think his last couple of years have really been certainly surprised. I've got to eat a bit of humble pie there because I thought he was not measuring up, but he's really earned his place.
I think the wide shot when you're watching the televised thing or being at the ground is what really shows Gary Rowan's qualities because the way he can. I mean, certainly if you're watching on TV, he's out of the shot, and then all of a sudden you can see him from a mile away tearing towards that player and chasing them down, or forcing a rushed play at that point that often leads to a turnover.
Yeah,
and that's
totally.
that's one of those immeasurable things that even a 1%er doesn't really do that sort of action justice.
Oh no, and we all know there's 1%ers are massive in footy. If you block if you can lay a block, there's a in my book I tell this story about I had this incredible 3 hours with Mark Thompson, in his warehouse in Port Melbourne, and he pulled up the last few minutes of the Sydney final that we lost in 2005. Yeah, and he talks me through like why we lost. It was so painful that it felt like the old Geelong. You must remember, Paul.
Oh, I distinctly remember it. Dad brought home a projector that night to sit back and watch it, and then I had the pleasure. Well, I didn't think it was going to be at the time, but I had the pleasure of interviewing Nick Davis earlier this year as well, and we spoke a lot about it. So
Nick Davis is the player who kills us in those last few minutes. Sydney do this play. It's clearly a play where their ruckman, I forget who it is, goes up, taps it into space, and all the Geelong defenders have stuck on their men and not moved into this space. So there's suddenly an opening,
vacuum.
right? And Josh Hunt is on Nick Davis. Nick is running towards the ball, and Josh goes after him, and a Sydney player comes in between him, blocks him, and game over. In the last 60 seconds, and that Sydney player who blocked Hunt basically won them the premiership because they won that year. And so those footies, to use the cliche, it's a game of inches. And I think that what Geelong has done over the years is develop. It does seem to become a place where that sort of teamwork counts.
Yeah.
Where the culture is very strong, and the thing that hurt us in the past a lot, the country town back in the 80s, 90s, Melbourne players didn't want to come and live there because the town was this Rust Belt, post-industrial town where all the factories were closing. Now people want to live there because, you can get
beach lifestyle and
beach lifestyle. Yeah. The players in the club who surf, the property is cheaper. Players like Cameron and Hawkins, want to be on the land.
Farm life.
They've both got farms down there. It's suddenly become a very good place to run a footy club out of.
Yeah, it really gives any player exactly what they want. If you want that city life, there's touches of it there, but also the big smoke is not that far away. And you've got, exactly all the things we touched on there, from the beach life to the farm life. Everyone's needs are really satiated when you go to Geelong, and so it's become this really attractive prospect. And the on-field results have really kind of helped cement the place as well, and helped bring those new names in the door.
Absolutely. You've got to remember that country kids are really overrepresented in footy, so and part of that is because often growing up in a country town, the footy club is so big in the town.
Yeah, it's the lifeblood.
It's the lifeblood. I went out to spend some time with David Wojcinski's parents, Charlie and Lee, and they live in Hayfield in Gippsland. And I spent a night there, and I went to the footy netball club, because the netball's so big, so much part of the football clubs in the country now. And basically everybody in town goes to the footy game.
Oh, for sure.
And so the kind of, and city kids have so many distractions, and footy's just one sport in the city, whereas in the country it's often the major winter sport for boys, and now girls and women as well. So I think given the overrepresentation of country players in footy in general, Geelong is going to reap that benefit because people are going to want to live in that sort of quieter environment.
Enjoy the lifestyle that they've been accustomed to for all that time.
Correct.
Um,
Yeah. Someone like Jeremy Cameron or Tom Hawkins.
Exactly right, and who knows how many more cows we'll see carrying premiership medallions around their neck in the
That's
future.
right.
Jeremy, if you can do that again at the end of the year because you've got a
Mate,
second premiership, that'd be fantastic.
you can do it anytime.
Yeah. And so I guess as we've spoken big picture, and there's the book there, and again I implore people to go check that out, and we'll inevitably talk about it again as we progress through this episode. But where does the love of footy begin for you? And was it always Geelong from the beginning?
Actually, no, it wasn't always Geelong. I grew up in West Hawthorn, and when I started going to the local primary school there, Hawthorn West, West Hawthorn, the school is right on the border of Richmond. A lot of kids barrack for Richmond. And I can remember my mates all followed Richmond. So I said, I follow Richmond, right?
Yeah, you do
and,
it's the social pool.
Yeah, I wanted to be liked, and one day I was about 7, I reckon, and my dad was driving me to school with my best mate Graham, who lived 3 doors up, and I said, "Hey, Dad, who do you follow?" And he said, "Geelong," and I said, "Me too."
Very nice,
And
easy win there.
easy, yeah. And from then on, it's like a fan is born and bound, basically. From that day on, I was with the Cats, and for quite a while when I was young, when you're a kid, kids can get really obsessed with footy. I was obsessed.
Yeah.
I was obsessed with footy. Collected the footy cards. Like it had a kind of footy had this magic aura. That it sort of loses when you get older. But I can remember 1970. I was 9 years old. We went down to Geelong. So Graham, my mate, 3 doors up.
Yep.
His family all followed South Melbourne, which is now Sydney.
The Swans. Yep.
Swans. And we were playing. South Melbourne was playing Geelong in Geelong, and the winner would make the finals. So like it was a huge game. And I remember going down there, and we took seats right on the fence, in the forward pocket, and there was Doug Wade standing 10 yards from me. And I remember, Paul, just this thing, like the ball was down the other end, and we were almost behind the goals, and he turned around with his hands on his hips, and he looked at the crowd in this kind of bored way. And I thought, my God, he's a human being. and just the kind of magic of footy when you're a kid, I guess. And, the sort of sense that it's all a bit larger than life. And, I love playing footy, and it all sort of started from there. And the barracking experience was kind of a different thing in those days.
Yep.
Every club had their own home ground. So you'd go to Essendon, and you'd go to Princes Park or Glenferrie Oval. Mate,
far more diverse landscape than what we have now.
You and I could kick a goal from the centre square at Glenferrie Oval.
Tiny little things.
Yeah, it's amazing, But each of those grounds had an incredible personality,
Yep.
and they were kind of stitched into the suburbs, and they reflected the personality and identity of those suburbs. I remember I lived in London for 3 years in the mid-2000s, and we were near the old Arsenal ground, and it was so stitched into the streets, that ground. It's just like it was just part of the fabric of life in North London. There was even a block of flats that had an entrance into the ground. You walked under this block of flats through a kind of entryway to get into the ground. So, that whole sense of footy having that kind of personality, Victoria Park, going to
what it represented
as a kid. So that's where it all began for me. And then sort of Geelong never winning, really makes you, even more obsessed, I know
something about that. Like you can get ground into the dirt, and yet you come back again. You come back harder.
More Saints fans are the most manic of all, aren't they? I mean,
just wait for the day that they win that flag.
I know.
If they ever do, because it does feel like there's a curse sometimes. But
yeah, it's very tough. But I know people who followed Carlton for years and sort of almost drifted away because they'd won so much, And I just say right now that'll never be me. However many premierships we win, I'll still be
soak it up.
into it. But I think all those years of not winning just made it so kind of
galvanizing, right?
Galvanizing, yeah, it's a good word.
And it is one of those things. And so I work professionally as a teacher, and so I come across a few teens who are Geelong supporters, and basically all their life, all they've known is a successful Geelong. And it is one of those interesting ones, as we have a rough start to this season, for example, or 2015 when we had a lesser than year, the only year in the last decade that we actually missed the 8. And you can see them waning very quickly. Now, there's probably the typical teenage thing where interests come and go and those sort of things, but like you could see it very quickly die off, and like I don't think you realise how good you've got it now. My journey with the Cats began in '89, so like I said, I missed the majority of the grand final losses really. In terms of consuming them live, I obviously went to as I came to learn more about the game, I would jump into the archives and watch '89 and see the heartbreak along the way and get a lot of context for when I was a little bit in those teen years, and I watched the Footy Show and Billy Brownless is getting poked fun at because he's lost four grand finals and all that sort of stuff, and it starts to, not to the same necessary level that you're talking about, but it starts to kind of create a harder shell up to a point. You've kind of been through these things, and galvanizes, as we said, but then
although
the jubilation is a whole other thing when it finally breaks.
Absolutely. I mean, for those players, I think it really hurts. I think, and in a way, the wins from 2007 onwards was bittersweet for them because it was great. They were all thrilled that Geelong had won, but they also, there was that pain of why didn't we get there?
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about what you said about the kids today just expecting success. Tim Darcy, who played in that '89 grand final and was a very good Geelong player, told me that he had a mate whose little kid went to Geelong game in these glory years recently, and about in the 2010s sometime, and we lost the game, and the kid came up to his dad, he said, "Dad, they're not playing our song. Why aren't they playing our song at the end of the game?" And so, I think, if you've grown up, if you're younger than 30, I think these have been just, gravy.
And especially the last 20,
That's right. And it's such a remarkable culture change from the Geelong that I knew growing up, and it's and I noticed that when my kids when my son and my daughter a little bit went to Auskick, you saw Geelong jumpers. When I was a kid growing up in Melbourne, you never saw a Geelong jumper in Melbourne. You just didn't see it, and
it was exclusively Geelong locals.
Yeah, it was, people they'd say, "Why do you vote for Geelong?" Like it's, and my dad had grown up in Ballarat and gone to school in Geelong, so that was the connection. Not a Geelong person by birth, but nowadays you see Geelong jumpers,
as regular as most.
Yeah, in the city. Yeah, it's regular as most, and kids love to be on a winner, I guess.
No, and look, I get that too, because when I was coming through my Auskick days, there was a lot of Essendon and a lot of the Western Bulldogs, and I guess proximity to both kind of parts of the city made that pretty clear. But I get the same sort of questions. Why Geelong? And like, for me, it was, well, my granddad played for them.
Oh, really?
And so
who was your granddad?
William James, who he only played 3 to 4. I hope you're not watching and I haven't got that number wrong. It wasn't many in the end, but yeah.
But I just want to say to William James, that's 3 or 4 games more than
any of us, right?
Yeah, sorry.
But like from that moment on, I mean, Dad was always crazy about the Cats, and I don't think there was ever a moment where I wasn't going to be a Cat supporter as a kid.
Yeah,
I had a cousin who he was brought up Richmond, and he drifted over to Geelong for a little while because I was, and then he drifted over, and then back to Richmond, and then North Melbourne, and then he stuck at North Melbourne. Like I couldn't imagine bouncing between clubs at that age. Now I know it's not an uncommon thing for kids. I won't allow that to happen with my own, I might add. But
well, I've got a mate who is about my age, and when his boy was about 9 or 10, he'd been sort of pretty much forced to follow Geelong, but he was coming to his dad and he was saying, "Dad, I think I'm going to beg for Carlton or Collingwood," and his father gave him $100 to stay, which was a huge amount of money. He said, "I'll give you $100 if you stay with Geelong," and he said,
you got me.
The kid was sensible. He said, "Okay, all right, I'll stay." And then suddenly Geelong started winning premiership after premiership. And so I think it was $100 well spent.
Worthwhile investment as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
Now, obviously, you did touch on some of your experiences with ball in hand. How were you as a junior back in the day?
I was okay, but it's a good question. I gave up footy after I left school, and I got to uni, and I was doing an arts degree, and the people I was hanging out with weren't really into footy much.
Footy inclined,
So I the women I wanted to impress weren't into footy, and So I stopped playing, but in the last 5 years, I've taken up playing Masters, which is the over
Yep.
50
Yep.
competition,
Yep.
and that's been a huge experience, Paul. Like it's been just, I'm so pleased that I actually went back and played footy. So I played. Met a lot of people I wouldn't normally have met. People from a whole bunch of different walks of life. You know, broke my ribs a couple of times, broke a collarbone. Had
Ooh.
all of that, but really had a great experience. And so I feel pleased that I managed to scratch that footy playing itch. Before I got too old and decrepit to be able to do it.
Yeah, for me out my neck of the woods, Masters kicks in at 35, and
Yes, that's right.
I've had
Yeah,
a couple people piping up and going, "Well, Paul, you're a year away. Like any
yeah,
chance you want?" And like, I'll still go out, and being a high school teacher, I find myself on yard duties. I'll find myself on yard duties on basketball courts of the oval, and if there's a footy that drifts over, I'll pick it up and have a crack at the sticks.
yeah,
You'll have lots of comments with staff, and there's a couple that still kind of play in the area. And like, any chance you want to jump into Masters? And
yeah.
like, I'm a frail little weedy thing. So there's like, okay, I could run away from these guys, no problems. But if they get their hands on me, that's it. I'm done.
Yeah.
It'll be the broken
Carnage.
collarbones and everything you're talking
Carnage.
about.
Yeah.
So
Look, it's interesting. One of the great things about Masters, I'm not sure about the 35 level, but at the club that I played with, Brunswick Mudlarks had a 35 team as well. And certainly at the older levels, you get this incredible range of abilities,
for sure.
and body shapes, and nobody minds that. Like there's just no criticism of that. It's people are there to have fun. I reckon at the younger years, it's probably a bit more ruthless, and maybe there's still a bit of you know, uh, bit of sniping that goes on, and what have you. But it's something you can keep up your sleeve till you. I honestly know guys who are 70 who are still playing footy. And it's amazing.
It's certainly tempting for myself. I just got to get my head around the idea that as long as if I'm vying with for the ball with one of the maybe heavier set blokes, I need to make sure
I
those
know.
first half a dozen steps that I get in are really
Yeah,
good ones to put myself a little bit of distance in, because otherwise, if
totally.
they can get
Yeah.
their hands on me, I think I'm done.
It's
And
also
so
having young kids. When you got young kids, I think it's hard to persuade your partner that you're going to be out and
there's that too. There's that too. Let
it's
alone the
not be
prospect of getting
possible.
injured and then having a longer layover as well. So
Exactly.
we'll see how that goes in the future. So where does writing come into the mix? Now you've got a range of different experiences. You were a speechwriter for Kevin Rudd. For anyone who's not aware, there's a range of different types of writing, obviously, that you've been kind of involved in. And so I guess, where did that itch come from in the first place?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to write as long as I wanted to play footy or watch footy. And I when I finished uni, I applied for a cadetship at the Age newspaper and got that,
Yep.
and so I was a journalist for a long time at the Age, and in the late 2000s, I got this offer out of the blue to write speeches for Kevin Rudd, and who had just become prime minister, sort of about a year before, and my dad was his name was John Button. He was a minister
Yep.
in the Hawke Keating governments, and so I'd had this connection to the Labor Party all my life as well. Not like as a member when I was a journalist. When you're a journalist, you don't really, you're not able to join political parties, and that's right. But I'd always had this. I'd grown up in a Labor Party family, and so to get an offer to write speeches for a Labor Prime Minister was just an offer that I couldn't refuse, really. And so I went to work for him for a year and a half and had an extraordinary experience.
I
Just,
bet.
it's funny, Paul, crossing that line from journalism and media, where you're writing about politics, to sort of being kind of inside the beast, the machine of it was just so mind opening for me, and things that I thought were kind of that I didn't understand started to become clear to me, and I enjoyed the process of putting a speech together. Speeches are really important in our culture. I mean, there's a great website called Speakola, which is organized by a guy called Tony Wilson, who, and this brings us back to our theme, actually wrote a book on the 1989 grand final.
Yep.
Tony was on Hawthorn's list for a short time, and he's a guy I know quite well, really lovely bloke. And that website has speeches from the last 100 years, including Alan Jeans's famous
Oh, really?
Pay the Price,
That's on
in
there too.
1989 grand final. That's there. and I think Tommy Hafey's speech when he yelled at Kevin Sheedy and got him a back pocket plumber is there as well. And so I really enjoyed the process of learning how to put a speech together, and seeing how speeches matter so much in politics. And after that, I've done various jobs. Like I do a lot of editing. I worked at a place called the Grattan Institute for a long time,
Yep.
helping them edit their reports, and I still write journalism on the side, and have written a few books, as well as I wrote a book called Speechless, which was about my time working for Kevin Rudd. And Comeback, the book on Geelong, was interesting because that was really a reported book. It wasn't my story. I mean, it's got a couple of
There's a
personal
personal flavour to it for sure.
yeah, it's got a personal flavour, a couple of personal chapters, but it's really a reported book where I went and interviewed Geelong people, and that was, I guess, it was a piece of journalism in that respect. So I love the journalist craft of going out with a notebook or your phone and just asking people questions and finding out what they tell you. I love pulling stories out of people.
Yeah.
Hearing their stories. It was fascinating talking to people learning about football through hearing from people who played it, and people who coached, and all of that sort of, the whole culture of a sport that is so central to our, for many
Personalities
people,
and the
yeah,
country.
yeah, to our country. And now we've got the AFLW. It's just so much more kind of democratic and balanced. That we have men and women both playing the game at a very high level.
Yeah, it's huge, and it's certainly one of those fascinating things being able to observe, and I guess focusing on the political side here, like being able to kind of observe and commentate from the outside. And as you said, there's almost like this fog of war over certain aspects that exist, but you can't quite get your teeth into them. To then actually being in there,
Yeah,
seeing it for yourself, and some of these questions I'm sure you had for the longest time finally being answered. Oh, that's why X, Y, Z. You finally got to
totally.
some of those
Yeah.
answers. It'd be huge, I'm sure.
And I think with footy writing, it's much easier to do it in hindsight. I think it's and look, the same is true to politics to some extent. You wonder what's going on inside that government, what's going on inside that footy club. It's often much easier to get inside a government, because politics is a talking business. They talk
Yep.
all the time. They understand how journalism works, what the deal is. I can talk to you off the record. You won't publish my name, all that sort of stuff. Footy clubs are really locked down places.
Yeah.
And when I came to research my book, I found it really difficult to find out too much about what was going on inside the club right now, as opposed to, say, 10 years before, when people who had, played or coached during that earlier time were now happy to talk about their experience. And, one example of that is Max Rook, who actually, of all the players who helped me with comeback, Max helped me the most. I think he's just a lovely bloke, and uh, very thoughtful guy. Has thought a lot about footy, and was a really very fine Geelong player in that.
Absolutely.
Such a hard player, but Max really thought about footy, and he was very revealing about the team aspect of it. And he had this idea of creating this thing called the Spirit, which was like a kind of ceremony. After their terrible year in 2006,
Yes.
the preseason, they were sort of on fire in the preseason. It looked like they had turned some corner, and he wanted to try and meld the team together in this kind of unit. So he came up with this idea. He and Joel Corey was a big part of it as well, of having this kind of ceremony where they all basically wrote their wishes on a bit of paper, then burnt the paper, and a bit like the ashes in cricket, they burnt
Yeah.
the paper and they put all the ashes
Put them all
into a
together.
kind of urn, and that urn was every game, because they were so what's the word, focused in 2007 on winning that flag and turning around all that history, and that urn was in the rooms, and after every game, the Spirit would be given to one player who'd done the most for the
Exemplified it.
team in that game. Maybe an incredible rundown tackle, one guy against two who won out, an amazing shepherd, just those 1% things, and that was such an insight for me to learn, how, Max had done this kind of sort of spiritual thing. He saw it as a religious thing, and he said for him that team was like a religious experience, and I was just fascinated to hear that, and
And it's the
to
sort of thing that rarely bubbles to the top
it
when
doesn't bubble.
and certainly when they're active players. And I don't want to I do not want to discredit any of the active players who've come on this show
No,
even, but like
yeah,
we were touching on it before we started the show today, that the access and how forthright and open
yeah,
a retired player is
yeah,
versus an active one. It's
yeah. That's
huge.
right.
The golf is
It,
massive, and there's the media training and all those sorts of things on top of it
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
And certainly, so much more media training goes into the players these days than what it did for someone who even retired 10 years ago, for example.
that's right.
But
Yeah, no, it's
it's how
true.
forthright you can and want to be.
When I mentioned the spirit to Tom Harley, he said, "Look," he said, I'm kind of for a long time I would never have talked to you about this, and he said it's only because enough time has passed and Max has talked to you about it that I'm happy to talk to you about it. There was just it's a kind of code of honor of silence, and you know, I mean, footy players, they're there to play footy. They're not necessarily always, you know, um, the most verbal of people,
Yeah,
and they're thinking about their game, and but it is very hard to get inside a club, and to really get a read in real time on the kind of the levels of harmony and camaraderie or not. Whether it's all working inside.
yeah,
It's only much later looking back do you
it's
get
locked down.
the stories. I mean, people write really good books on clubs that win premierships, but they're usually happy experiences. Do you know what I mean? Because the
Yeah,
clubs won, right? Um, but
getting a
I
glimpse into those darker days is sometimes even more important and even more
yeah.
revealing.
Yeah, that's right. And I remember I had half an hour with Joel Selwood, and he's just a lovely bloke. But he turned up at the interview at 2:00, which was the appointed time, and he left at 2:30, which is the appointed time. He was captain at the time, and if I asked some question, which is like a delicate attempt to try and make some comparison between Mark Thompson and Chris Scott. He said, "Oh, mate, I don't answer any of those questions." And fair enough. He's got a job to do. At that time, I still felt that I got some really good things out of him. Looking back at the
Yeah,
07 to 09 period, but I was just struck by how much he was, as no, was he captain then? I think he was captain already. How much
yeah. By the time you're doing the book, absolutely, yeah,
yeah, how much he was on message and just really focused on, you know, probably the next game and
yeah.
and winning the flag that year, and so I think the more stories we can get out of footy in that way, the better. I still feel that um, there's a lot of mystery there. There's a lot of, how does a player just come out of nowhere? How did we, Tom Stewart, recruited from the local area, Tom Atkins, recruited from
Through the
Geelong.
VFL and all those sorts of
Yeah,
stories, that it's
these are
huge.
amazing stories, really. And I love the way Geelong still kind of throws up some of the,
More than most, more than most
Pod,
clubs.
James Podsy Adley,
Oh yeah,
he'd been there as a kind of trainer at the club and was suddenly playing in a premiership, And I feel like there's something still a little bit kind of quirky and interesting about Geelong that feels like footy the old way,
and,
Yeah,
and long may that live. And
totally.
I
Yeah,
guess I guess in reference to what you've achieved with the book, I mean, massive congratulations, because those sort of stories are
thanks,
huge,
yeah.
and to be able to get those sort of insights and be able to share them with the masses who don't get to have a peek behind the four walls, perhaps ever. Um, it's works like yours that serve as Like, I am not doing anything near the caliber of what you're doing with this show, but at the same
No, but
time,
it's
it's
great
those.
you're doing what you do. I mean, it's a chance for people to think about footy and to
Through a different
um,
lens.
for a different lens. I think the players who go on your show, the past players, I think would really appreciate the chance to kind of think and reflect on their time in footy,
Oh, it
and
was huge to get to the chat to the likes of, and I mean we're talking about players still from. I mean I've had the likes of Barry Stoneham, who've obviously lived
yeah,
through I
yeah,
guess some of those darker days with the attempted premierships that didn't work out. To then the likes of Matty Stokes, for example, who obviously had a
yeah,
lot of his own challenges that he
yeah,
had to face through his career as well, and to be able to chat to some of those boys and get these open, like really raw and open conversations about
yeah.
those darker moments is like it's hard to hear.
Yes,
And like
totally.
it's so much different to reading a report that's splashed upon the across the paper or whatever it happens to be. And that's again not to discredit anyone who writes those reports, because that's, I mean, you're presenting the facts, but to be
Of
able to
course.
hear from
Yeah,
the person, and you
yeah,
can hear it in the voice and that sort of thing. And like it's been really humbling for myself to have gotten this opportunity. And Ben, I know you're watching and listening right now, if nothing else, to make sure that I haven't said anything horrible during this episode. But like it's I'm really thankful to Ben to have been able to put this opportunity in my lap, and for me to be able to get to chat to all these people. It's been, and including yourself, because
it's
everyone's bringing
great,
this
isn't it?
amazing, unique perspective to it.
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure you feel this because I certainly did in doing the research for that book, was just the learning.
Yeah.
I remember I spent ages trying to talk to Cam Mooney, and he didn't want to do it, and I was going through other players, and they said, "No, mate, he's not interested. He doesn't want to do it," and then finally I just fronted him at this Geelong event, and I walked up to him and I said, "Hi, Cam, I've been the guy chasing you. I wonder if you'd talk to me." And he looked at me, and I could tell that he's a decent bloke,
Oh
and he
yeah.
looked at me. He looked at me and he said, "Oh yeah, mate, I'll do it." And when he did it, we sat in a cafe in what they call Pakenham Street in
Yep. Pakenham
Geelong,
Square.
and he talked for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and he was fascinating. He had so many interesting, very thoughtful guy, so many interesting insights. And I remember one of them. He said to me, he's talking about his very poor form in around 2003. He said I couldn't see the game. I couldn't anymore see the game. I said, what does it mean to see the game? He said, well, it's like this. He said, Scala's got the ball on the back line, and Chappie is wheeling out on the wing, and I know it's going to go from Scarlo to Chappie, and then it's going to come to me. He said, that's seeing the game, and I sort of got this insight a bit into how footballers, think about what it's like on the field. Tom Lonergan told me that when he played that incredible game on Cloak in the
Oh yep.
2011
The grand final.
grand final, said he said I wasn't thinking about the game at all. All I thought about was Travis Cloak. Is it Travis? Is he the
Yeah, Travis Cloak.
which
Yep.
cloak is it? I think it's Travis Cloak. There's been quite a few cloaks, and he said I just keep thinking minute by minute. Another minute he hasn't touched the ball. Another minute. Fascinating. Like he wasn't thinking about
The
anything except
scoreboard
that.
or anything else.
No, just that task that he had, because Cloak had that belter of the first quarter, and kicked two or three goals from
Big
a
bomb.
couple of them from outside the 50 meters, and and uh, as I said, talking to Mark Thompson about, he said when a team is going well, you can tell that a team is a very strong team when everybody on the field talks all the time.
Yep.
He said in that great Essendon side that he was in the 80s, like Thompson won two premierships, I think, in his first 2 years as a player. He played in premiership sides, and he said, Terry Danaher was captain. He said, but Gary Folds was captain. Leon Baker was captain.
Just a
Van der
constant
Haag.
buzz,
They were
noise.
all captains.
Everyone's a
Simon
part of it.
Madden's captains. He said Madden used to say, "You stand over there," he said I didn't stand there, and he said, "Why? I'm not gonna." He said, "Why weren't you there?" And he just swore at him. He said, "Next time I stood there," and you could see. He said at Geelong when he arrived, nobody talked. They were all shy, all silent, and so they had this big thing at the club to get them talking. Not just on the field but off the field. They got players to read chapters in books and then stand up, give a presentation in front of the other players, just to teach them how to talk. And by the end of that period, when we won all the flags, you wouldn't have had a more mouthy talking team than Andrew Mackey on the back line, just
Stevie J with
complete
his casual credit and
Stevie
those sorts of
J,
comments.
Andrew Mackey, uh, just trash talking out the block, Uh,
But
so I
it makes a
remember,
big difference. Communication's obviously integral to everything, and I
yeah,
mean, in good
it
organisations,
is
people are talking, communicating properly, and that's no different when you're on a football field.
totally. Have a look at Luke Hodge when he played footy. He's just talking all the time, arms going, you go there, you go, just directing
Directing the
things.
troops.
So these, for someone who hasn't played high level footy like me, these were all great insights. I really found it fascinating. How much head stuff there is in the game. How much thinking goes on. Someone like Joel Corey, who is a quiet guy, doesn't say a lot, but doesn't have the words, but is super smart. And just hearing him talk about that experience of learning at Geelong what leadership meant, because he always thought a leader was the person who stood at the front and shouted at everybody else,
Yeah,
because that's what he learned growing up in footy. He said, at Geelong, people said to him, you can be a leader in another way. There are other ways to be a leader, just by your dedication at training, by bringing along a couple of kids, and I really saw at Geelong some evolution of the culture of the place, so that
yep,
when someone like Simon Hogan suffered quite extreme depression,
yep.
the players all he wasn't a top line player, but they all got around him all the same, in about 2010, 2011. And you see how a club starts with, sort of, we're going to do these things, build our culture. And then you start to just get this kind of snowballing effect of people having, some of the Indigenous players were coming up with ideas for things they wanted to do in Indigenous communities. And there was a guy there called Ron Watt, who was the
Yep.
players sort of, who was the kind of, the one who looked after the players, that was his role. Ronnie was very important in the club at that time, and he had a very close relationship with Matty Stokes. They were very close, and it became a place of innovation. People started doing inventive things down there. I think, very hard to sustain that, but they seem to have done so.
Well, I mean, it is one of those ones that like it builds momentum and it starts to snowball, as you say, and it becomes a case of where. I mean, the group that, Joel Selwood came in and inherited some of that. He came in at a perfect time and built some of that, and Tom Hawkins, and that group that, some are there, some have on the brink of retiring, others have left, like Joel. But that gets passed on to the next group that comes in under them, and if done right and having the right structures around, it does continue. And I think that's why, like those structures, those foundations around the key playing figures are so sound that it's allowed this to continue to nurture and foster, and the next generation comes through and just adopts it. You see what happens with the new crop this year, an Ollie Henry or a Tanner Bruin, for example, who've just come in and they've adopted this mentality, and they're so family focused. And I mean, I still remember when Tanner Bruin was drafted, all the jokes about no smile and the unhappy and sour and those sort of things. He comes across to Geelong, and we saw it. It didn't really happen right away, but then a few weeks in, a month in, and all of a sudden he's cracking jokes and smiling and public facing in ways that he wasn't before. He just seemed to fall in love with it instantaneously.
Totally. And you see, it's just interesting for me to see players that I initially didn't rate that much, like Brian Myers. He's really developed. He's really come on, and his game in the last,
it's amazing.
3 or 4, amazing. It just really, small guy, doesn't kick it a long way, but has got footy smarts. And he kept us in the game against Sydney, and when we're getting flogged, really. And Tom Atkins, not the fastest guy on the ground, but really tough. Really
never
tough,
backs down,
and has added so much. So, and the development of the defence, like really probably the best back six going around, I'd say. So who knows? I reckon hard to win this year, Paul, but I reckon we could give them a fright.
I mean, they're talking the talk. Who knows?
Yeah, that's right.
And the on-field form is starting to mirror that talk a little bit. So who knows? As Chris Scott says, we are the danger. I'm going to trust him. I'm going to put my faith in him and the squad. And maybe scratching that top 4 might be a little bit too hard. But who knows what sort of damage and carnage we can create from that point and potentially steal ourselves another premiership. So
and even if we come from the bottom 4, who knows?
So
Who knows?
It,
We might go. Need them all on the park though. We can't afford to have any injuries.
Yeah, no more
That's
injuries. Let's
yeah,
kind of clean all that up, and if Jeremy Cameron can start to find a little bit of touch too at this point of the year, that'll be just the
yes,
cherry on top right now. So as
right.
we start to wind down, James, it's been fantastic to pick through your journey so far and the love of the Cats and the work you've done around the Cats. Some lighter ones as we start to wrap things up. In your eyes, and you've had this amazing perspective of being inside the club, outside the club. You've seen many generations of players come through. Who, in your eyes, is the greatest Cat?
Oh
Now
God,
that is, and I guess for putting it out there straight away, there's so many different lenses we can look at that through. There's the definition of the
yeah.
greatest Cat, and some people might start to think down the Joel Selwood part because of everything he's kind of brought to the club. You can talk about outstanding players, whatever happens to be, through sheer skill. There's so many
It's
different lenses
look,
to look at it.
so many different lenses. But look, Paul, I got to say Joel Selwood. I really do. I know that's not a very original statement, but I just think for his leadership, his courage, his decency, you know, uh, I just you can't go past him. He really does embody. Even you go back to 2007. When they lost the round five game against
Oh
North
yeah,
Melbourne, and they pulled all the players got in this meeting. This crisis meeting that ended up being the meeting where everything turned around. And someone said, pointed at Selwood and said, "Look at that kid. Look at the way he's putting us all to shame. The way he's going in. And you know, I'll tell you a story about Joel Selwood. This again sort of impressed me. When I interviewed him, I had read the files, and there'd been this story, I think, in the Herald Sun about when Joel Selwood was a kid in Bendigo. There was a kid with a disability who played on his team. So there's down to tens or something, right? And Joel was determined for this kid to get a goal, according to the story. And in the last minutes of the game, even though this was completely unnecessary, he made this incredible effort. Finally, got a handball to this kid who kicked a goal.
yep.
And I said this to Joel in this interview. He said, "That never happened."
Oh really?
It really impressed me as a story because it was something
It
we
fits
could
the
have said,
narrative,
yeah,
right?
yeah, that happened. Yeah, it's a great narrative. It can make you look the best guy. And he said that never happened. And it was one of footy's full of urban legends. This story had gone facts, and I just thought, that's an honest bloke, and uh, insanely competitive, mind you.
Oh,
Um,
never back
so
down.
Joel, look, I've had my faves over the years. I loved watching Matthew Scarlett play footy in defence. Loved Jimmy Bartell. Max Rook. These are all. There's pretty much everybody in that great side from '07 to 11.
There's so much to love.
So much to love. Now, of course, we've probably had, arguably the greatest player of all time in Gary Ablett Senior, but Gary was so troubled as well, and
Yeah.
I think in a way, this is not his fault at all, but that sense of Geelong being this team that loved brilliant individuals, was sort of embodied in him, and then you have his son, who's also another incredible player. When you think about some of the great players he was just a, phenomenon to watch as well. So we've been lucky. We've really had an amazing feast.
Yeah, it's been quite incredible, and I guess you've segued perfectly into my next question there. So, schoolyard pick. You're building a team, and you've got junior and senior standing in front of you. Which way are you going?
Oh no! Oh God! It's funny. I think in a game in 2009, Junior gave it was like 13 handballs was it in a quarter or something?
That
Or
sounded about
I
right.
can't remember, but it was a massive. And Gary in 93, Gary Ablett Senior gave 13 handballs the whole season. So
Times have
I
changed.
remember,
Context is everything.
yeah, times have changed, to be fair, and also he's playing full forward where you don't handball so much.
Well, yeah.
You tend to have a
I know.
ping.
Speak to Tom Hawkins about that.
Yeah, that's right. So look, senior and junior, it depends on the role that's required, I guess. Um, uh,
Very diplomatic.
gee, I look, I'd probably go junior. I think
That's fair.
just for the bit of extra team capacity,
Oh, look,
and
you can play it full forward and
yeah,
you can serve it up to you on a silver platter, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Um,
Of the
uh,
current crop.
but like,
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
oh, no. The current crop. Look, I'm a big fan of Mark Blitzarves. I
Yep.
think he's been a really great sort of warrior for the team. But probably my favourite player. I just love watching Tom Stewart play.
Oh, of
It's just
course.
so calm. Just the composure on the in the back line. The silky disposal. Um, the way he picks out of two players. And really Stewart is the more, I suppose, in terms of skills and everything, the more consummate player.
Yeah.
Um,
But
who else?
they both
Tom
have
Atkins.
really immeasurable qualities as well.
They do. Yeah. Well, Blitz is the sort of player you can put anywhere, really. And
The old Mr.
I think
Mr. Fix It.
one thing, once Jeremy Cameron came along, it was just fascinating to see those two big guys, huge blokes, roaming everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Like there was some point last year, Chris Scott seemed to say gave Jeremy Cameron a kind of passport and said you can go anywhere you like. He was just traveling wherever he wanted to go.
Whenever he wanted to do it.
And
No rhyme or reason. I don't
whenever he
think he
wanted
knew
to
what he
do
was
it.
doing half the
Yeah,
time.
yeah, exactly. I also love watching Tyson Stengel play. He's added so much. We were really struggling with that small forward role. We tried to
Yeah.
fill it for years, and he's just come along and filled it perfectly. And
And what a redemption story for him as well, with everything
what a
he'd been
redemption
through.
story. Yeah, yeah, and Eddie Betts having that role down there, coaching him for a while, and it's just he's an amazing story. So, there are a lot of players who I still love watching Tom Hawkins. I remember that 11 grand final when he just seemed to just suddenly grow before our eyes.
That was huge.
Now, it's just the way he just started pulling down every single mark. Now, he was helped by the fact that Ben Reid was probably injured, and struggling. But just that suddenly we saw Tom Hawkins, this player had always had a bit of the yips about him, just nerves and stuff. Suddenly, although to be fair, he played a good game in the 09 grand final, as well.
Yeah,
But
true.
in 11 he really came alive as a player, and you saw it the year after when he just had this breakout year, 2012, and kicked that goal after the siren against Hawthorn.
Personal favourite, that one.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. The ball just keeps going and going and
Oh,
going.
yeah, I think it was like an 80-metre kick now, right?
Yeah, 80, 90, whatever.
Yeah, there we
He
go.
was
Good.
kicking out.
Let's keep building that one out.
Yes.
Now, I must say, every time
Yeah.
we go to play Hawthorn, I watch that back still to this day. It's been
Yes.
more than 10 years, and I'll still cherish that moment.
That's
And was
right.
fortunate enough to
Yeah.
be there when he did it, so it was great.
Yeah.
Of the next generation that's coming through, we got a young underbelly there that is still developing its craft and building its game. But is there anyone that you personally have taken a bit of a fancy to and can't wait to see more of?
Max Holmes, for sure. Or do you mean even younger than him?
I mean, if there's
because
an even younger person, then please go for it.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, not sure. I've got a friend who keeps up. I don't keep up with the VFL as much as I should,
Yep.
But I've got a friend who's got a big raps on Dempsey in the
Yes.
VFL.
Chloe Dempsey's been fantastic.
I think Max Holmes, just because he adds that speed, we do struggle for speed a bit, and he just adds so much there, And you mentioned Tanner Bruin. Interesting seeing Jack Bowes playing in defence,
Yep.
And so they're all and who can deny Ollie Henry's out of a heap on the forward line.
I mean, you wait, like he
how-
keeps flying for these marks. One of those is going to clunk soon, and it's going to be a Jeremy Howe style mark of the year. It's just a matter of time
It
at
is.
this point.
Yeah.
So-
It really is. I suppose still a bit of a question about seems to be working so far. But having both him and Gary Rowan on the forward line, can they sort of find their, both be
Their
effective,
niche.
and find their places? But so far seems to be working really well. I think. I sort of feel the piece that Jake Nile wrote last year about the Geelong kind of premium. I think it's going to keep going for a bit longer. Because if players want to play there, um, they will. The club is going to benefit from that sort of sense that there's a culture there of developing players, making them feel very much part of the unit. That's gonna I think. Hope I'm right. Because obviously we're seeing a change now. Paddy's
Yes.
not can't have much left. Tom Hawkins can't have much left. Isaac Smith. Um, there's a bunch of players who, are near the end. Even
Right at
someone
that
like
tipping
Mark
point. Yeah.
Blicavs, been playing footy for a long time. And Mitch Duncan, been a great player. And so, how do we manage that transition? Um, I, I think the evidence seems to be that we might.
Yeah, I think
if
I think we can too. And there's, on top of everything you've just said, there's that culture of success that's been built too, and that is an attractive one as well. Obviously, there's so many players chasing that elusive premiership, and you can only have one team out of 18 that wins it every single year. And
That's right.
Geelong's, these days is batting at a better average than most. So you feel like you're
Yeah,
always in with a
that's
chance.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. What have we had now? We've had 125 years of VFL AFL, and it's Larry Donahue, the Geelong full forward from the 1970s, who pointed this out to me that if of those 125 years, the team that's won the most premierships has won like 18 or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not sure the number will count. Is it Essen? Is it
I think we're at 17 for
Collingwood? I
whichever
don't know.
team it is that's on top.
Yeah,
Yeah,
17. Yeah. As you said, of the 125 years of the VFL AFL, in 108 years, the best side in the comp hasn't won the premiership. It's a good, if you think of, say,
16 each. Sorry for Essendon and
EPL, the
Carlton.
soccer, and Essendon Carlton, 16 each, yeah. So you have that kind of spread, of premiership winners, and they're so hard to win, and we're so focused on the premiership when often a lot of clubs have great seasons but don't win the premiership. So I feel like the Geelong, if you can keep that culture, there's no reason why the club can't stay strong for a very long time to come.
Absolutely, and long may it continue, because it's been great for us these last 2 decades, and well, I hope that cliff isn't
Yeah.
coming, and that we can navigate our ways away from it nicely. Well, James, it's been fantastic to have you on the show, and learn about your love of the Cats, where it all began. Learn about the writing approaches, the various different experiences, and of course your inside the four walls experience as well. It's been awesome to have you on board the show. So thank you very, very much for that. If people want to, I mean, I'm not sure if there's more
I've
Geelong
really enjoyed
centric.
it.
I'm not sure if there's more Geelong centric work on the way in the future, but if there so happens
Ah,
to be, where could people
yeah.
go to find the book, to keep in touch, see what you're up to?
Yeah, so look, I'll shamelessly make the plug.
Please.
Can come in. I kept hoping they'd win a premiership in the year after or the year after that, so I could do a reprint, but it wasn't to be till 2022. But I'm actually I'm working on a piece. I don't know how it's going to end up, but about playing footy myself in the Masters.
Oh
So
yeah.
that might turn out next year sometime, hopefully, or I'm not sure when. I've got to finish it first, and but yeah, look, I um, don't have any plans to write another book. When you do a footy book, there's something. I invested so much in this book, just so much time that it's sort of like getting
The energy to
getting
do it
the
again.
armor up to do it again. I think I couldn't do it. I'd have
Yeah,
to
that's
go and
fair.
do something else. But I feel I think a lot of Geelong fans would say this, that the older Geelong fans, that it's been such a satisfying experience to have gone through all those dark years, and then to have watched the change in the club and seen that club, seen that change, play that on the field successfully. And that's why I guess I picked Joel Selwood, because I think he embodies that so much. Um, it's been a great life experience, really.
So everyone watching and listening, please make sure, if you haven't already done so, pick up The Rise and Fall of Geelong. It is a fantastic book, and it's been, like I said earlier in the show, I had that moment when I saw your name, and then had the moment looking at the bookshelf going, wait, we're talking about the same person, aren't we? It's been a real privilege to get to chat to you and pick your brain, and thank you so much for coming aboard.
Thanks, Paul. I've really enjoyed it. And as we always say, go Cats.
Yeah, and listeners,
there, don't we?
Listeners, viewers, if you haven't already done so, please make sure to subscribe to The Hoop Show on YouTube, Behind the Play on podcast feeds. And exactly as you said, James, go Cats, remain Geelong strong, and we'll see you next week.